Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission today is it's pretty profound and frankly a little unnerving.
I think so.
We are plunging headfirst into the underlying psychological machinery that drives how we judge things, and more specifically, what fuels all this political polarization we see everywhere.
Right. It's the big question, isn't it? Why do rational arguments just fail? Why do they consistently fail to bridge that divide?
Exactly.
We've spent a lot of time synthesizing a wealth of sources from moral psychology, and the picture that emerges is it's one where the political battles we see, on TV and online,
Yeah.
they're really just surface level conflicts.
Just the tip of the iceberg.
Totally. They're driven by this deep, instinctual moral grammar that we rarely, if ever, access consciously. And the goal of this deep dive is to kind of give you the blueprint of that grammar.
And the central discovery that our sources deliver, it really challenges the very foundation of how we see ourselves as rational beings.
It really does.
It's this profound insight that conscious reasoning, the thing we all pride ourselves on, is generally not designed to find objective truth.
No. Its purpose is strategic justification.
Strategic justification.
This is the premise that unlocks everything. I mean, if you walk away with just one key takeaway today, it should be this mantra: intuitions come first, strategic reasoning second.
So we don't think our way to a conclusion.
No. We feel our way there, and then we think of a reason why. We aren't scientists looking for data. We are lawyers looking for a conviction.
That distinction, wow, the difference between a judge and a lawyer, that feels like the core realization right there.
It is.
Because if you expect your political opponents to respond to evidence like a scientist, you're just going to live in a state of perpetual frustration.
Always. But if you understand that reason evolved as a social tool, to advance our interests and defend the teams we belong to, then suddenly all the chaos of modern politics, it just clicks into stark focus.
Right. It starts to make a weird kind of sense.
And this framework leads to a powerful, I'll admit, a pretty uncomfortable conclusion about human nature.
Which is?
That we are, by design, self-righteous. We are exquisitely evolved to be hypocrites. We can generate these flawless, airtight justifications for our own actions.
While instantly spotting the tiniest moral flaw in our opponents.
Instantly. It's a superpower.
Okay. So we are going to dedicate the next 30 to 40 minutes to exposing the intricate psychology behind that righteousness. We'll reveal the true, startling role of your inner lawyer.
We'll also map out the 6 hidden moral taste buds that sort of pre-program your political perspective.
And we'll explore the ancient biological hive switch that transforms individuals into, warring political tribes. This is going to be a targeted, evidence-based exploration of why you believe what you believe. Let's unpack this. So let's start with what we're calling the core thesis of the source material. This idea that our mind's conscious thought is surprisingly subservient to our gut feelings.
Right. The principle is simple, but it's really hard to accept at first. Intuitions come first, strategic reasoning second.
And to help visualize this, we have this central metaphor for the mind, often called the rider and the elephant.
Yes, the conscious language-based system, the one that generates your internal dialogue, your formal arguments, that's the small, relatively weak rider. And the rider thinks it's in charge.
It's holding the reins, it's pointing the way, or so it thinks.
Exactly. But the rider is sitting on top of this vast, powerful, and overwhelmingly emotional, intuitive system, the elephant.
And the elephant is where all your gut feelings live, your emotions, your immediate reactions, your deeply ingrained habits, all that stuff.
And if the rider and the elephant disagree on which path to take,
the rider almost always loses. The elephant goes where it wants to go.
It just does. And this isn't just a clever metaphor. It's grounded in evolutionary biology. The automatic, intuitive processes of the elephant have been running animal minds for over 500 million years.
So they're fast, they're efficient.
And essential for survival. They guide that instant approach or avoidance behavior. Human language and complex reasoning, the rider, is a very, very recent evolutionary add-on.
So it evolved to serve the elephant, not control it.
That's the key. The rider's job is less about steering and more about, say, cleaning up after the elephant and making sure it looks respectable to everyone else. It's the PR department.
So how do we actually know the elephant is running the show? I mean, it feels like I'm in control.
It does. But the most compelling evidence comes from these scenarios that trigger what psychologists call moral dumbfounding.
Okay, what's that?
These are these classic studies where people are confronted with harmless but Disgusting taboo violation.
Harmless but disgusting.
Okay.
So think about a scenario involving consensual adult incest between two siblings. They use protection, no one gets hurt, they both feel it brought them closer. Or the case of someone eating a piece of sterilized, legally obtained human cadaver tissue from a pathology lab.
Okay, yeah, definitely disgusting. When people hear these scenarios, their intuitive system, the elephant, immediately registers profound moral condemnation. It's often accompanied by this intense feeling of disgust.
I can feel it, but here's the kicker, right? This is the dumbfounding part.
This is it. When the subjects are asked, okay, but why is that wrong given that no one was harmed? They struggle. They struggle desperately to articulate a logical reason.
So they just start inventing reasons after the fact.
Completely post hoc justifications.
Yeah.
They'll argue the siblings risk genetic damage, even when you've explicitly told them contraception was used.
Right.
Or they'll condemn someone for cutting up a flag, arguing the remnants could clog up the toilet. I mean, it's totally missing the point that the transgression isn't practical, it's symbolic.
The reasoning brain is just scrambling to invent a logical-sounding reason for a feeling that arose instantaneously, completely independent of logic.
And even when the interviewer gently eliminates every single one of their suggested possibilities of harm, the subjects almost never change their mind.
So what do they say?
They often resort to this final, very telling phrase, I just know it's wrong, but I don't know why.
Wow. So the intuitive judgment stands firm even when the rational mind comes back completely empty-handed.
That is definitive proof that the judgment comes before the justification. And that's where we identify the true role of our conscious reasoning. It functions as the inner lawyer.
Not a judge.
Not a judge impartially weighing evidence. It is a defense attorney, or as you said, a press secretary.
Okay, so the inner lawyer's job is twofold. First, generate these compelling, sophisticated justifications for what the intuitive president, the elephant, has already decided.
And second, and this is maybe even more important, to protect the individual's moral reputation, both to themselves and to their social group.
This sounds a lot like the Glauconian hypothesis.
It ties right into it. Named after Plato's character Glaucon, who argued that people only behave justly because they're afraid of the consequences of getting caught.
So we care more about appearing moral than actually being moral.
Our sources suggest we care deeply about it, because your reputation is absolutely essential for successful social living. The inner lawyer helps us maintain this appealing moral identity, even when we're acting on purely selfish or intuitive grounds.
And you can see the strategic reasoning get even more intense when people know they're going to be held accountable, right?
Oh, absolutely. The research shows that when subjects know they have to explain their decisions, they don't suddenly become more open-minded or balanced.
They just get better at digging in their heels.
They get better at what's called confirmatory thought. They search harder and faster for any reason that supports their initial intuition.
And this is especially true for intellectually gifted people, which is so counterintuitive.
It is. Studies confirm that people with higher IQs or greater analytical skills aren't necessarily better at finding objective truth. They're simply better at generating my-side arguments.
So they become these supremely effective inner lawyers. They can build these complex, seemingly airtight cases for whatever their elephant has already dictated.
Which is why highly educated political partisans are often the most difficult people to sway with facts. Their lawyer is just better.
So how does this whole strategic mechanism affect what we accept as truth? If our brain is functioning like a lawyer, we're only selectively searching for evidence.
Exactly. It results in what we term motivated reasoning. When we encounter new information, our goal isn't necessarily accuracy.
It's comfort, or consistency, or just defending our team.
Yes. When we want to believe something, say a study that validates our worldview, we subconsciously ask a very simple question. Can I believe it?
That's a pretty low bar. You only need one or two pieces of supportive evidence, and the answer is an easy yes.
But when we encounter threatening information, a study that contradicts our deeply held political beliefs or exposes a flaw in our chosen candidate, we switch the question completely.
We ask, must I believe it?
And that is a very high bar.
Because scientific findings are rarely absolute, right? There's always something to pick apart.
Always. There are statistical probabilities, margins of error, methodologies.
Yeah.
Your inner lawyer can always find a plausible-sounding reason to say no. You can question the study's funding, the ideology of the researchers, sample size.
So for the average person in the political world, there's basically no such thing as a finding you must believe if it contradicts your elephant.
Pretty much.
Yep.
And that's a profound challenge to that whole Enlightenment ideal of pure rationality, which brings us back to that essential insight from the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio.
That reasoning, the writer, it just can't function on its own.
Damasio showed that when the link between emotion and intuition, the elephant in conscious reason, the writer, is severed by brain damage, the result is not some ultimate rational human.
No, it's a profoundly incompetent human, someone who can't make even simple decisions.
Exactly. Like choosing a time for their next appointment or navigating basic social situations. Reason requires the passions. The emotions provide the immediate valuation, the prioritization. That logic alone just cannot supply.
So we have to dispense with this idea that reason is our savior. It's a tool, and we use it strategically. But if our reasoning is just justifying our gut reactions, what exactly is that moral gut reaction built from? Where does it come from?
And that is the perfect transition.
Yeah.
The realization that our judgment is intuitive and strategic leads us directly to our second core principle.
Which is?
There's more to morality than just harm and fairness.
Okay, to understand this, we first have to recognize this deep cultural bias that's inherent in a lot of Western intellectual thought. We're calling this the weird anomaly.
Right. WEIRD is an acronym. It stands for Western, Educated, Individualistic, Rich, and Democratic Cultures.
So us.
Basically, yes. The vast majority of psychological research, policy debates, even philosophical arguments about morality, they all focus very narrowly on justice, rights, and preventing harm. The classic harm principle from John Stuart Mill.
And the sources show that this hyper-individualistic view, where the fundamental unit of reality is the autonomous, unique individual, is actually highly unusual when you look at it through the lens of global cultures and history.
It's an outlier. If you assume the world is just full of separate individuals, then of course your entire moral system is going to be constructed to protect individual rights.
Yeah.
You'll naturally prioritize harm and fairness above all else.
But outside of these specific weird cultures, morality is much broader.
Far broader. The anthropologist Richard Schwitter, his research established that morality generally encompasses three ethics that exist right alongside that ethic of autonomy, which is harm and fairness.
Okay, so what are the other two?
First is the ethic of community. This ethic places the group, the collective, the institution, above the individual. Its moral focus is on things like duty, hierarchy, respect, and loyalty.
So moral violations in that domain would be things like failing to do your duty, not upholding your responsibility within the social order.
Precisely. And the second one is the ethic of divinity. This is the idea that we are sacred vessels and that the body and soul are connected to something transcendent.
So this would emphasize things like sanctity, purity, avoiding degradation.
Exactly. Violations here often involve things like inappropriate sexuality, desecration of sacred objects, or what's seen as moral contamination.
This research fundamentally changed how we map the moral mind, didn't it?
It did. It showed that when people in places like India or Brazil condemned certain acts, say a son insulting his father, or some minor disrespect towards a religious symbol, even when they agreed there was no physical harm, they were being irrational.
They were just operating with a broader moral code, one that included community and divinity in addition to autonomy.
And this brings us to the 6 moral taste receptors, or what's called moral foundations theory.
The idea here is that just like our tongue has basic receptors for sweet, sour, salty, and so on,
The human mind is equipped with 6 innate, highly sensitive psychological first drafts. And then culture and experience come along and shape them into full, complex moralities.
Okay, let's dedicate some serious time to these 6 foundations, because they really do seem to be the DNA of the political divide.
Absolutely. So number 1, care harm. This is the most universally acknowledged foundation. It evolved to help us protect vulnerable offspring.
And it generates feelings of compassion, motivates us to alleviate suffering, and triggers that intense hatred of cruelty.
In modern politics, this is the primary driver for issues like poverty relief, animal rights, foreign aid, all of that.
Okay, that's straightforward. What's next?
Number 2, fairness cheating. This evolved for reciprocal altruism, the basis of human cooperation. You can summarize it as tit for tat.
And it's fundamentally focused on proportionality and punishing free riders, people who take the benefits without paying the cost.
Right, and this is where political interpretation starts to diverge really sharply.
How's-
Well, crucially, liberals often interpret fairness as equality of outcome, striving to level the playing field for all.
Whereas conservatives, while they also value fairness, typically stress proportionality, so equity based on effort and procedural fairness, meaning everyone just follows the same rules.
And from that perspective, equality of outcome can be seen as unjust cheating against those who worked harder. The foundation is the same, But the implementation, the interpretation, is fundamentally different.
Okay, number 3.
Loyalty betrayal. This foundation evolved to help us form and maintain strong cooperative coalitions, which were essential for survival in our tribal past.
So it makes us incredibly sensitive to who is a team player and who isn't. And it drives that intense, visceral condemnation we reserve for traitors.
Yes. Betraying the group is often judged as far worse than being an open enemy from the start. This is the engine of political tribalism.
In politics, it manifests as patriotism, prioritizing national interests, the demand for absolute loyalty to a political party.
Exactly. Just think of the intense revulsion Dante reserved for treachery in the innermost circle of hell. It's an ancient, deep psychological trigger.
Okay, number 4.
Authority subversion. This evolved to help us navigate hierarchies successfully, allowing us to forge mutually beneficial relationships within those rank structures.
So it makes us sensitive to signals of rank, respect, and submission.
And while weird cultures often view authority primarily through the lens of oppression, this foundation is really about stability and order.
It's the feeling that we should show deference to elders or to religious figures or legitimate governing structures.
The story of that taxi driver from Jordan who wanted to move back home specifically so his son would learn to respect his father and the social order, that is a perfect illustration of this foundation being strongly activated.
Right. Number 5.
Sanctity degradation. This is the one that often mystifies people who are raised only on that ethic of autonomy. It evolved in part from the behavioral immune system.
The instinct to feel disgust and avoid potential contamination feces, rotten food, sick people.
Right. And it relates to purity, contamination, and treating the body, or the flag, or sacred texts as something requiring respect.
This foundation is clearly visible in political debates around sexuality, environmental contamination, diet.
And it also explains why acts that are technically harmless, like that consensual cannibalism case we mentioned, provoked such outrage. The act is condemned not because of physical harm, but because it violates the sanctity of the human form. It treats it as degraded, profane meat.
And finally, the 6th foundation, which was added to the theory a bit later.
Liberty oppression. This evolves not just from a desire for individual freedom, but from the collective resistance to bullies, that ancient mechanism of forming reverse dominance hierarchies.
Where the group bands together to restrain would-be alpha males.
Exactly. This foundation is triggered by what are seen as illegitimate restraints on freedom and perceived tyranny.
It's the rallying cry for the "Don't Tread on Me" flag on the right, fueled by anger against government overreach and excessive regulation.
But it also fuels the left's fight against systemic oppression, corporate control, and institutional restraints placed on vulnerable groups. It is the rebellious foundation, fundamentally driven by the desire to resist domination.
Okay, that gives us the full palette of moral tastes. But why do these tastes translate into such fierce, unwavering political tribes? I mean, how do we jump from individual taste receptors to full-blown warfare between groups?
That's where we move from the individual psychological structures to the evolutionary architecture that binds us all together, what our sources call the Hive switch. So the underlying theory here suggests that humans aren't solely rational, selfish individuals, like economic models often assume.
No, instead we are genetically programmed for collective action.
Our sources describe us as being 90% chimp and 10% bee.
Meaning we have these powerful mechanisms designed to suppress our own individual interests for the sake of group cohesion. This is groupishness.
And this concept requires us to just briefly revisit the idea of group selection. It's a bit controversial, but the argument is compelling.
The idea being that while evolution overwhelmingly favored the selfish gene at the individual level,
at the group level, groups that succeeded in coalescing, cooperating, and exhibiting deep trust generally defeated the less cohesive, more self-interested groups.
So the individual who was willing to sacrifice for the group might lose out personally.
But the victorious group, whose members possessed the psychological capacity for groupishness, they passed on their culture, their norms, and their collective genes to the next generation of groups. And this led to the evolution of mental adaptations that favor group survival.
And our ultrasociality is built on this shared invisible net of understanding, shared intentionality.
Yes, this is the ability, which is unique in its complexity to humans, to construct reality through shared agreements, conventions, and narratives.
So things like money, or a nation's border, or the meaning of a flag.
Exactly. These things are real only because we all agree they're real. We construct these vast, powerful, yet entirely weightless and portable moral communities through these shared conventions.
And once a moral community is established, we have a collective identity built on shared gods, shared norms, shared taboos.
And the physiological mechanism that allows us to actually feel this collective identity, to transcend the ego and merge with the we, is the collective effervescence, or the Hive switch.
This is a functional system within the mind, right? Involving hormones like oxytocin and neurological structures like mirror neurons.
It is. It allows individuals to temporarily lose themselves in a collective experience, generating those sacred, binding feelings of community that the sociologist Emil Durkheim first described when he was watching these intense religious rituals.
And you see this switch flipped everywhere in modern society. Synchronized dancing, group chanting at a rally.
Military marching, or singing the national anthem with thousands of other fans at a game. These collective actions momentarily shut down the ego and merge the individual into the group, building immense trust and cooperation.
Our sources even refer to certain experiences as Durkheimian drugs.
Yes, like psychedelic compounds. They frequently produce these non-selfish, mystical unity experiences where the sense of the individual self just dissolves and the connection with the collective or the universe becomes overwhelming.
So that chemical experience mimics the intense feelings generated by collective ritual.
That's the idea.
This all seems so beautiful, though, a pathway to universal peace. But there's a critical, dark twist delivered by evolution here.
There is. The biology only promotes parochial altruism.
What does that mean?
It's the crucial limitation. Oxytocin, which is often called the cuddle hormone, it doesn't bond you to humanity in general. The research shows it specifically bonds you to your group. It makes you more trusting, more helpful, and more altruistic towards your in-group.
But it can simultaneously increase aggression or suspicion toward the outgroup.
Especially if that outgroup is perceived as a threat to your team. So we are generous, helpful team players, but that generosity stops abruptly at the border of our moral community.
Which explains why religion, which is such a strong tribal marker, is so essential to human society. We have to understand the conspiracy of religion not as a set of irrational beliefs,
but as a masterpiece of social engineering. Religion is not primarily about belief, it's about belonging.
Right. So the new atheist critique, which sees religion as inefficient fantasy, it's just missing its profound social function.
Completely. Costly religious rituals, like extreme fasting, giving up pleasurable substances, or time-intensive community service, they are not wasteful. They are powerful mechanisms for reinforcing social cooperation.
And solving that endemic free rider problem.
Exactly. The logic is brutal, but effective. If you demand massive, costly sacrifices, only those who are truly committed to the group will be willing to pay the price.
The sources cite that study on American communes.
Yes, showing that secular communes, which demanded minimal sacrifices, almost always failed quickly. Only 6% lasted 20 years.
But in contrast, the religious communes, which demanded high levels of sacrifice, had a 39% success rate.
The master variable was the amount of costly sacrifice.
So by sacralizing those constraints, making them feel necessary and transcendent rather than just arbitrary rules, religion generates immense moral capital.
And the shared belief in powerful, angry gods who enforce collective punishment, a drought on the whole village for one person's transgression, that reinforces social control and makes shame a highly effective regulator of behavior.
So it binds pluribus into unum. It creates the cooperative architecture that's necessary for society to scale up.
It does.
Okay, so we've established that our minds are strategic, our moralities are diverse, and our sociality is intensely tribal. Now let's apply this complex framework to the current political landscape.
The polarization that we observe in modern Western democracies, it's not a consequence of one side being inherently moral and the other one being evil.
No, it's a conflict between two deeply held but fundamentally different moral matrices built on those 6 foundations we talked about.
And we can see this clearly when we analyze the results from massive data sets like yourmorals.org, focusing on the partisan matrix.
Okay, let's break that down.
The liberal matrix shows a strong, often overwhelming reliance on just 2 of the foundations.
Care and fairness.
Care and fairness, with fairness being heavily weighted toward equality and protecting victims of oppression. Liberals tend to be highly suspicious of appeals to loyalty.
Which can breed nationalism.
Authority, which can breed hierarchy and sanctity.
Which can breed puritanism and sexism.
Right. So the sacred value of this matrix is universally caring for the victims of oppression.
And the conservative matrix, on the other hand.
It endorses all 6 foundations more equally. They still care about care and fairness, of course.
Yeah.
But their appeals are much broader. They incorporate patriotism and team spirit,
Loyalty,
respect for police, the military, tradition,
authority,
and family and traditional values.
sanctity.
Exactly. And this broader appeal allows their moral language to resonate with a much larger portion of the inherent human moral toolkit.
And this difference creates a fundamental and pretty dangerous phenomenon we're calling the blindness of righteousness.
It is. Because liberals often score so low on loyalty, authority, and sanctity, they struggle to even comprehend the legitimacy or the coherence of conservative positions that are rooted in those foundations.
So, for instance, a conservative defense of traditional institutions or police authority, which is rooted in authority and loyalty, is often instantly interpreted by the liberal matrix as a failure of care.
Or as a cynical desire to maintain inequality. This leads directly to Manichaean thinking. If you don't share my two sacred foundations, you must be motivated by malice or cruelty or selfishness.
You're not just wrong, you're evil.
But the blindness is equally acute on the other side.
Right. Conservatives who are dedicated to preserving order and tradition often fail to see the institutional flaws or the need for change when their rigid adherence to tradition inadvertently reduces care or fairness.
Or fails to limit the predations of powerful interests that are exploiting the system.
So when liberals push for systemic reforms in the name of equality and autonomy, conservatives often interpret that as a deliberate attempt to destroy the social order.
To undermine loyalty, break authority, and desecrate sanctity, they see destruction, not progress.
This brings us back to that crucial concept of moral capital.
Yes, this is the outside-the-mind stuff that supports an ethical community.
So shared values, trust, common norms, functional institutions like family and civic organizations.
All of it. Moral capital is necessary for a successful society to operate, but it's invisible, and it's often undervalued by those who focus only on individual rights.
And this concept is really essential for understanding the conservative perspective.
It is. Because reforms that weaken fundamental groups like the family or neighborhood associations or religious traditions, even if they're done in the name of maximizing individual autonomy, they risk inadvertently destroying that moral capital.
The sources discuss the example of certain welfare and social programs introduced in the 1960s.
Right. While they were aiming to help the poor, some of these policies inadvertently created incentives that reduced the value of marriage, weakening the family structure, a key institution for transmitting moral capital, especially among the inner-city poor.
So if you don't acknowledge that institutions like family actually generate moral capital, you won't foster the systems that protect it.
You'll just see them as constraints on individual freedom.
However, we have to make sure we maintain balance here and show the counterpoint critique, which often comes from the libertarian and liberal perspectives, especially concerning the market. Let's look at the market as a moral tool.
Good idea. Libertarian wisdom really emphasizes liberty, arguing that markets, when they function properly, are miraculous engines of innovation and efficiency.
Because they incentivize accountability.
Exactly. They argue that when consumers pay the full price, competition drives innovation. The classic example is the reduction in the cost of LASIK eye surgery,
Which dropped nearly 80% since its introduction.
because it was rarely covered by insurance and consumers paid the direct cost. It's a perfect example of market efficiency creating a public good.
But, and this is a huge but, the liberal critique reminds us that markets can fail spectacularly when they generate massive, deadly externalities.
Costs imposed on others without any accountability. This is where regulation becomes a necessary moral tool, not just a bureaucratic hurdle.
And the decades-long corporate block on banning lead from gasoline is just a horrifying case study in market failure prioritized over public health.
It's awful. Despite clear, overwhelming scientific evidence going back to the 1920s that 200,000 tons of airborne lead per year was retarding neural development in children.
Causing lifelong harm and potentially increasing violent crime.
The chemical industry and major corporations successfully used their immense financial and political influence to block regulation for decades.
So in this case, corporate interests, these superorganisms focused only on profit, were basically given the metaphorical ring of gauges, the ability to operate invisibly and without accountability.
And regulation here wasn't social engineering designed to undermine the moral order. It was a necessary intervention to protect public health and moral capital from externalities that the market mechanism entirely failed to address.
So the conclusion is pretty undeniable. Both matrices possess this profound, necessary wisdom, but both suffer from equally profound blind spots.
The gridlock isn't caused by a lack of intelligence. It's caused by moral psychological programming that makes it nearly impossible for one matrix to genuinely appreciate the coherence of the other.
We have covered a vast amount of territory. This deep dive has really exposed the underlying intuitive psychology that transforms political disagreement into perceived moral evil. Let's quickly recap the 4 bombshell truths we uncovered.
Let's do it. First, your conscious reasoning. The writer is fundamentally your brain's lawyer. It's strategically hired to protect your social reputation and justify the automatic decisions already made by your intuitive elephant.
Second, morality is a complex, richly textured set of 6 evolved taste receptors: care, fairness, loyalty, authority, sanctity, and liberty, not just the narrow focus on harm and justice favored by weird academic elites.
Third, tribalism is an ancient, biologically reinforced feature of human nature, the Hive switch. It was designed by evolution to make us parochial altruists who fiercely love and trust our in-group while remaining inherently suspicious of the out-group.
And fourth, political gridlock is the inevitable consequence of 2 highly effective yet different moral matrices seeing each other's foundational virtues as moral deficiencies. This leads to that Manichaean good versus evil thinking that prohibits compromise and dialogue.
Which leads us to the final, necessary, and I think provocative thought. The increasing polarization and gridlock in our world. It may not be caused by moral deficiency at all. It might be caused by physical and social segregation.
We are increasingly living in these self-selected lifestyle enclaves, and the data is staggering. Nearly half of all Americans live in landslide counties, where one party dominates by 20 percentage points or more.
We have willingly and subconsciously sorted ourselves into politically and morally homogenous communities, the Whole Foods counties and the Cracker Barrel counties. And this segregation is actively starving the elephant.
What do you mean by that?
I mean the elephant, your powerful intuitive mind. It only learns trust and empathy through sustained, positive, cross-group interaction. When cross-party friendships disappear, the inner lawyer is given free rein to confirm the worst possible stereotype of the opponent.
It becomes easy to treat the opposition as irrational or even evil.
Of course, you have no counter-evidence.
So the challenge we leave you with, based on this entire psychological framework, is profoundly practical. How can we redesign our physical environments and our social institutions to force positive cross-party friendship?
How can we create spaces, whether they're civic, educational, or professional, that force the intuitive elephant to feel trust across the moral divide, and by doing so, restrain the inner lawyer?
Because if the problem is outside the mind, if it's structural and social, then the solution has to be structural and social too.
It has to be. This deep dive has given you the map of your righteous mind. Now the task is figuring out how to navigate the complex social terrain we've all built around it. We encourage you to explore further how these 6 foundations manifest in your own life and in the debates you follow.